In the suffocating snowstorm, a blood-soaked Malinois staggered into the police station, carrying the blood-stained red scarf of the missing girl. Its eyes burned like fire, leading the way to a terrifying truth: the kidnapper was the very man the whole town trusted. This isn't just a rescue. It's a fight for survival, a battle between darkness and light. Hit subscribe now so you never miss our most thrilling and emotional episodes. The storm had swallowed Pine Creek whole. Snow hammered against rooftops like fists of ice, the kind that didn't simply fall but slashed sideways in furious sheets, driven by a wind that howled through the pines like a living thing. Streetlights flickered their glow, fighting a losing battle against the white chaos, casting the town in fits of shadow and pale ghost-like beams. The power grid sputtered again, and for the briefest heartbeat, everything went black. Then the lights shuddered back to life, weak and trembling, as if afraid to be seen in a night like this. Inside the sheriff's office, the heater clanked, but barely worked, coughing lukewarm air into a room that felt as cold as the storm outside. Papers lay scattered across the desk, reports smudged with coffee stains and muddy fingerprints, maps marked with desperate circles, and red ink that bled like wounds. The air smelled faintly of wet wool, stale coffee, and exhaustion, the scent of men and women who had gone too many hours without sleep, too many days without hope. Sheriff Logan Reed sat hunched at the edge of his desk. A man built from stone and silence, though now the edges of that stone were beginning to crack. Once years ago, he had been the kind of man others believed could not be broken. Ex-Marine, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, a figure that carried authority without needing to speak. But tonight, his eyes betrayed him. They were bloodshot and hollow-haunted, not only by the storm raging outside, but by something far colder: the unbearable absence of his little girl. Logan held a photograph in his hand, the edges worn soft from being touched too many times. The picture showed a laughing 6-year-old with hair the color of autumn leaves, cheeks flushed, dimples carved deep from joy. Lila Parker. She wasn't his by blood, but by something far deeper. Her mother, Erin Parker, had been his late wife's closest friend, and after Erin's sudden passing, Logan had stepped into the life of her widowed husband and daughter as quietly and naturally as if it had always been meant that way. He had sworn to protect Lila as fiercely as he would his own child, and now she was gone. 3 days, 72 hours since the call came screaming through the radio: missing child. 6-year-old female last seen in her front yard at 4:15 p.m. It had been chaos from the start. Volunteers scouring the woods, bloodhounds pulling against their leashes, helicopters thundering low across the valley while their searchlights combed the snow. For a while, the entire town of Pine Creek seemed to be moving as one, united by the urgency of a child's disappearance. But as the hours dragged on, as the storm grew teeth and the nights grew colder, people began to trickle away. First it was the neighbors with tired eyes, then the distant relatives with excuses of work in the morning. Finally, even some of the deputies began to falter, their hope cracking under the weight of brutal, gnawing silence. Now, on the 3rd night, the search grid had collapsed under the storm's fury. The helicopters grounded, the bloodhounds too weak to continue. Only Logan remained, refusing to surrender to the white void clawing at the windows. A knock rattled the office door, dragging him back to the moment. Deputy Rachel Hines stepped inside, her coat dripping melted snow onto the linoleum floor. She looked young, though the shadows beneath her eyes had aged her a decade in the past 3 days. Her lips parted, ready to deliver more bad news, but she hesitated when she saw the photo in his hand. "Sheriff," she said softly. Logan didn't look up. "Tell me you found something." Her silence stretched loud enough to fill the entire room. She swallowed hard. "We covered the North Ridge again. The drifts are 6 feet deep. It's not safe to keep the teams out there. They're saying..." Her voice trailed off. "They're saying it's over?" Logan finished for her, his tone flat, emotionless. Rachel shifted uncomfortably. "No one's saying that. But it's been 3 days. In weather like this?" Logan slammed his fist against the desk, rattling the coffee mug and scattering pens to the floor. "She's not dead." The words tore from him, raw and sharp, shocking even himself with the force behind them. The room fell into stunned silence. His chest heaved, his jaw clenched until it ached. Rachel's eyes softened. "I know you don't want to hear it, but we have to be realistic. The temperature dropped to 12 below last night. A child her age without shelter." She didn't finish the sentence. Logan finally looked up, his stare cutting like glass. "Lila's not just some child. She's a fighter. She's got more grit in her than half this town combined. I don't care if it's been 3 days. Until I see her body, I will not stop. For a long moment, Rachel held his gaze, then nodded faintly. I'll keep the phones open. She left without another word, leaving the storm's roar to fill the void. Logan leaned back in his chair, dragging a hand down his face. His skin burned with exhaustion, and the stubble on his jaw felt like sandpaper against his palm. The clock ticked louder than it should have, each second punching holes through the silence. In the corner, the scanner crackled with static, but no voices answered. The search had gone quiet. Too quiet. Logan's mind wandered unbidden back to the last time he had seen her. Lila had been in the yard, bundled in her red parka, cheeks glowing as she tried to build a snow fort with walls that refused to stand. She had looked up at him from behind the half-collapsed mound eyes, bright with mischief. Bet you can't make one better, Sheriff, she'd teased her giggle, cutting through the cold like sunlight. He had smiled, a rare thing for him these days, and knelt to help her pile snow into crooked towers. That was the sound he held on to, now the sound of her laugh. He refused to believe that sound had been silenced. The office door creaked open again, this time, without a knock. Deputy Brian Carter entered, his shoulders hunched, his parka frosted white. He didn't bother shaking the snow from his boots. His face carried a look Logan had come to recognize too well over the years, the look of a man about to deliver news no one wanted to hear. They're pulling the volunteers, Carter said quietly. Weather Service says the blizzard won't break until morning. No one can see 5 feet in front of them out there. If we send anyone back into the woods tonight, we'll be risking more lives. Logan stared at him, unblinking. I'll go myself, he said finally. Carter shifted uneasily. You can't track in this weather. You'll lose your bearings. Hell, you could freeze before you make it half a mile. Then I'll freeze trying, Logan shot back. Carter ran a hand through his damp hair, exhaling heavily. Logan, I know what this means to you. God knows I do. But maybe it's time to face the possibility. Don't. Logan cut him off, his voice low, dangerous. Don't you dare say it. The storm shrieked outside, pressing against the windows, as if to force its way inside, to smother them in white silence. Carter hesitated, then nodded stiffly. All right, I'll stay on radio. You do what you have to. He left, closing the door softly behind him. Alone again, Logan pressed his fists against his eyes, fighting the sting of tears. He couldn't afford them. Not now. Not when she was still out there somewhere, maybe scared, maybe cold, but alive. She had to be alive. The wind roared louder, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a tree cracked and fell, the sound echoing like a rifle shot through the night. Logan's chest tightened, his breath shallow. He shoved back from the desk, grabbed his coat, and strapped on the flashlight he had worn for the past 3 days. He paused only long enough to glance once more at Lila's photograph. Hold on, kiddo, he whispered. Just hold on. Then he stepped into the storm, the door slamming shut behind him as the blizzard swallowed him whole. The clock had crawled past midnight when the storm reached its cruelest pitch. Pine Creek lay buried in silence and snow, the streets all but erased beneath white drifts that swallowed fences, porches, and cars alike. The town looked like a ghost, painting itself over with frost. Even the sheriff's office seemed to shrink in the face of the blizzard, the lone island of flickering light in a sea of darkness. Inside, Logan Reed had given up on coffee hours ago. His hands shook too much to hold the cup steady, and the bitter taste had turned his stomach sour. He sat at his desk, staring at the maps spread before him, though the red-inked circles and desperate notes had blurred into meaningless shapes. His body was there, but his mind was somewhere out in the storm, with the child he refused to lose. The door rattled once. He barely noticed. Just the wind again clawing at the hinges. Then it rattled again, harder. Logan's head snapped up. The storm's howl was loud enough to drown anything else, but this wasn't the wind. This was weight. Pressure. Something alive forcing its way inside. His hand went instinctively to his sidearm as he crossed the room. The door shuddered a third time, then burst inward. What came through was not a man, not an attacker, but a shape low to the ground, staggering, covered in mud and blood and snow. A dog. Logan froze, his breath locking in his chest. The animal collapsed onto the linoleum floor with a heavy, wet thud, its chest heaving, paws trembling as they tried and failed to lift it again. It was a Belgian Malinois, or what remained of one. Its coat was caked with mud and ice, streaked with dark patches of blood. One ear was torn, its flank ripped open, the kind of wounds no ordinary house pet could have survived this long with. And yet it had. Around its torso, fastened by strips of torn flannel and rope, was something that made Logan's knees nearly buckle. A scarf. Bright red, smeared with blood, dangling in tatters. He didn't need to touch it to know. He had seen that scarf every winter for the last 3 years, wrapped around the neck of a little girl who laughed at the snow and dared him to race her up the hill. Lila? The name broke from his lips in a whisper, strangled and hoarse. The dog stirred at the sound, its head lifting weakly. And for the first time, Logan met its eyes. They weren't the glazed, empty eyes of an animal too far gone. They were sharp, burning with a strange, stubborn fire. Amber flecks glimmered in the dark pupils, piercing through the pain that racked its body. The look wasn't pleading. It wasn't asking for help. It was commanding, demanding. Pay attention. Don't waste this. Logan dropped to his knees beside it, hands hovering uselessly above the blood-soaked fur. Where did you get this? Where is she? His voice cracked too loud in the stillness. The dog let out a low, guttural sound, more growl than whimper, its gaze never breaking from his. Then it tried to rise again, legs trembling, paws slipping on the slick floor. Easy, boy. Logan's hand steadied the animal's shoulders, though he knew the touch hurt. He had dealt with military canines during his years in the service. This wasn't the clumsy loyalty of a pet. This was a working dog. Trained, conditioned, and bleeding out on his office floor. His eyes dropped again to the scarf, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. It wasn't just a scarf, it was proof. Proof she was alive. Or had been recently enough that the blood hadn't frozen. The door behind him creaked again, and Deputy Carter stumbled in, blinking against the sudden sight. Jesus Christ, Carter muttered, rushing forward. What the hell? Logan cut him off with a sharp motion. Close the door, now. Carter obeyed, slamming it shut against the storm. He crouched beside the dog, his eyes widening as he took in the scarf. Is that? It's hers, Logan said, voice low and firm, no doubt. The dog's chest heaved, each breath rattling like broken glass. Its eyes darted between the men, then toward the door, as if urging them onward. You know this animal? Carter asked. Logan hesitated. The truth was yes. He had seen this Malinois before. Not up close, not like this, but always on the edges. A shadow slipping through the tree line near his house. A set of paw prints in the snow that appeared and vanished without explanation. Once weeks ago, he had looked out his kitchen window and found the dog sitting in the yard at dawn, watching the house with the same burning eyes. He had stepped outside and the animal had bolted before he could take 2 steps. He had told himself it was just a stray. That's what he'd wanted to believe. But some part of him had known better. I've seen him, Logan admitted finally. His voice was rough. Around the property, thought he was just passing through. Carter frowned. That's no stray. Look at the way he's rigged that scarf. That's Christ, that's deliberate. Logan nodded slowly. Somebody trained him. Somebody sent him here. The realization slammed into him like a blow. If the dog had been trained, then maybe he hadn't just stumbled across the scarf. Maybe he had been with Lila. Maybe he had stayed, protected her, followed her. And if that was true, then he wasn't just carrying evidence. He was carrying a message. The dog shifted suddenly, pushing against Logan's grip, trying to rise. Its body trembled violently, but the fire in its eyes refused to dim. Logan moved quickly, bracing its weight. You want me to follow you? Logan whispered more to himself than anyone else. The thought was insane, reckless. But as the dog's gaze locked with his, the insanity melted into certainty. This wasn't coincidence. This was direction. Carter shook his head. You can't seriously be thinking. I don't think. Logan snapped. I know. He's trying to tell us something. The dog let out a sharp, strained bark, the sound echoing through the office with startling clarity. Then with agonizing slowness, it staggered toward the door, its claws scraping against the tile, leaving faint streaks of blood in its wake. Logan's throat tightened as he rose to his feet. He grabbed his coat flashlight and the rifle propped against the wall. Carter grabbed his arm. Logan, this is crazy. You're talking about following a half-dead dog into a blizzard. He could lead you straight off a cliff. Logan pulled free, his eyes never leaving the dog. Or he could lead me to her. The Malinois, Ben. The name came unbidden into Logan's mind. Though he had no idea why, reached the door and turned back, waiting. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, but his stance was firm. He wasn't giving up. Logan's jaw set hard. He swung the door open, the storm immediately blasting them with a wall of ice and wind. Ben stepped out first, head low, shoulders tight, a soldier on a mission, despite wounds that should have killed him hours ago. Logan followed, pulling the door closed behind him, leaving Carter standing frozen in the office, the storm already erasing their footprints. For the first time in 72 hours, Logan felt something in his chest that wasn't despair. It was direction. It was hope. The snow was a wall. It beat against Logan Reed's face like shards of glass, slicing at the skin around his eyes, stealing his breath with every gust. His boots sank with each step, the drift swallowing him, almost to the knees. But he pressed forward, teeth clenched, heart hammering in his chest. The world outside Pine Creek had become a wasteland of white, endless, merciless, a place where sound itself seemed swallowed before it could travel more than a few feet. And ahead of him, moving with a determination that defied the wound stitched into his body, was the dog, Ben. The name had stuck in Logan's mind the moment the Malinois appeared, though he still couldn't explain why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was because this dog, beaten and bloodied, radiated the same steady will as a soldier in the field. Ben's movements were deliberate, purposeful. He wasn't wandering. He wasn't guessing. He was leading. Logan stumbled after him, one gloved hand tight around the flashlight, the other gripping the rifle slung at his shoulder. The beam of light cut through the storm in fractured arcs, catching glimpses of the dog's black and tan coat, the flash of an amber eye as Ben glanced back to make sure Logan was keeping up. Branches cracked under the weight of snow. Somewhere in the distance, the storm groaned like a living thing. Logan's breath came out in sharp bursts, clouding the beam of his flashlight, but he didn't slow. Not when every step meant he might be closer to Lila. The dog veered sharply to the left, toward a stand of fir trees that bent beneath the weight of ice. Logan followed, pushing through the branches that clawed at his coat. The scent of pine was sharp in the air, mingled with something else, something metallic. Ben stopped suddenly, his body stiffening. A low growl rumbled in his chest, muffled by the wind, but unmistakable. His nose dipped close to the ground, inhaling, searching. Then he looked up at Logan, eyes flashing. Logan's pulse spiked. He dropped to one knee beside the dog, brushing snow aside with his glove. Beneath the thin crust, a streak of red smeared across the white. Small, faint, but blood. His throat tightened as he stared at it. Lila, the scarf hadn't been a lie. She had been here, not long ago. He swallowed hard, forcing his focus back into place. He couldn't afford to fall apart now. Not when she was close. He glanced at Ben, whose ears twitched at the sound of the storm, his muzzle dusted with frost. "Good boy," Logan whispered. His voice cracked against the wind. "Find her." The dog gave a sharp snort, then pushed forward again, weaving between the trees. Logan followed the world, narrowing into the trail Ben carved through the snow. The deeper they went, the more the evidence began to surface. Not enough to shout, but enough to whisper. A branch snapped off low, jagged edges, fresh, not yet buried in ice. A piece of rope frayed, tangled at the base of a tree trunk, the kind used for binding, not for climbing. Logan crouched to study it, fingers brushing the fibers. They were stiff, stained, dark. A rope, a child's blood. His stomach twisted. His wife's voice came back to him then so vividly. It was as if she were walking beside him in the storm. Erin standing on the porch years ago, her dark hair catching the sunlight, her eyes fierce even as her body had grown frail. She had been sick for months, but her spirit had never weakened. That day before the hospital took her for the last time, she had looked at him with the clarity of a dying woman and said, "Logan, promise me this, don't ever stop fighting if a child needs you. Don't ever give up, not for anything." He had promised. He hadn't known then how cruelly that vow would come due. His chest ached as the memory burned inside him, sharper than the cold. He pressed on. The storm roared louder, the trees groaning under its weight. Logan's flashlight beam caught something pale, half buried in the snow ahead. He hurried forward, crouched, and brushed the powder aside. A mitten, tiny, blue with white stitching across the wrist. He recognized it instantly. Erin had bought them for Lila the winter before. His breath caught. "She's here," he whispered, voice breaking. Ben growled low again, the fur along his back bristling. His nose swept the ground in quick, sharp motions. Then, with sudden certainty, he barked once sharp and cutting through the blizzard like a flare. He darted forward, his gait limping but strong, as if the scent had burned into him. Logan forced his legs to move faster, stumbling through the drifts. His lungs screamed for air, his muscles trembled with exhaustion, but none of it mattered. The dog had found something. They broke through a clearing, the storm momentarily thinner beneath the high pines. The air shifted. Logan smelled it too now, not just pine and snow, but something acrid. Sweat, rope, the faint lingering bite of gasoline. Ben froze, head snapping toward a thick stand of brush. He let out a deep, guttural growl so low it vibrated through the ground. His ears flattened, his stance lowered into the tense posture of a predator ready to strike. Logan lifted his rifle, scanning the brush. His heart pounded like a war drum. Then he saw it. Just beyond the tangle of branches half buried in snow was a boot print. Not a child's, a man's. The edges were fresh. Logan's breath came sharp and fast. He crouched low beside Ben, his hand brushing the dog's neck, feeling the tremor of muscle beneath the battered fur. "You smell him, don't you?" Logan whispered. Ben's answer was a rumble, a sound that carried both fury and certainty. The world around them seemed to still the storm, fading into background noise, the silence sharpening into a blade. They weren't alone. Logan felt it in his bones. He thought again of Aaron's words, the promise he had made. He tightened his grip on the rifle, his other hand steadying Ben's trembling flank. "Show me, boy," he said. His voice was steady now, anchored in the kind of determination that didn't break. "Take me to her." Ben's head dipped once in what felt like an answer. Then muscles taut, he stepped forward into the brush, the growl still simmering in his throat. And Logan followed, every nerve in his body alive, every step carrying him deeper into the unknown. Into the place where a little girl's hope and a man's promise might collide with the darkest truth Pine Creek had ever tried to bury. The storm had swallowed the world whole by the time Logan Reed and the battered Malinois reached the clearing. The air was sharp with the scent of iron and pine, and every gust felt like claws scraping across exposed skin. His flashlight beam cut across snowdrifts and dark trunks, searching desperately for what Ben seemed certain of. Then, at the far end of the clearing, Logan saw it, a mound beneath the snow, unnaturally even, like a shape trying to hide in plain sight. Ben stopped dead, his body rigid, tail stiff. His paws dug into the powder claws, scraping frantically. He barked once, sharp and urgent, then began clawing at the mound, sending clumps of snow flying. Logan's stomach turned. He rushed forward, dropping to his knees. He brushed away the snow with his gloved hands, heart hammering, breath ragged. And then just beneath the frost, the steel edge of a door appeared. Rusted, weathered, camouflaged by vines and time. A mine entrance. The old Pine Creek mining tunnels had been shut down decades ago, sealed off after a collapse killed 3 men. Locals said the whole network was cursed, too dangerous to reopen. But now here it was. Not cursed, not forgotten, used. Ben's barking grew louder, more desperate, echoing off the trees. He clawed at the door until his injured paw left streaks of blood across the metal. Logan grabbed the handle, yanked. Nothing. The latch was frozen solid. He slammed his shoulder against it once, twice. Rust groaned, but held. "Damn it!" Logan hissed, stepping back. He raised his boot and kicked hard. Metal rattled, flakes of rust bursting into the cold air. On the third strike, the latch gave way with a jagged screech. The door swung inward, exhaling a stench so foul Logan's stomach lurched. It was a breath from the belly of the earth, damp stone rust, and something sharper. Mold. Mildew. And beneath it all, a metallic tang, like old blood. Ben pushed past him, instantly, limping but relentless, his growls low and constant as he disappeared into the darkness. Logan flicked on the flashlight, raised his rifle, and followed. The beam cut through blackness that seemed to swallow everything beyond its reach. The tunnel was narrow-lined with rotting wooden supports that creaked as the storm outside howled through unseen cracks. Water dripped rhythmically from somewhere deeper inside, each drop echoing like a clock ticking down. Every step echoed too loud. Logan's boots crunched over gravel, sending sounds skittering into the dark. His chest tightened with the realization this wasn't just a tunnel. It was a tomb waiting to be sealed. Ben moved ahead, nose close to the ground, shoulders tense. Then he froze, body rigid, ears twitching. He let out a sharp warning bark, his head turning toward the wall. Logan swung the flashlight. The beam hit the surface, stone damp and stained. And then he saw them. Drawings, dozens of them. Childish scribbles scrawled across the rock in waxy crayon, some smeared by dampness, others still startlingly vivid. Stick figures with lopsided smiles. A small girl drawn again and again, holding hands, with a taller figure. And beside them, always a dog. Logan's throat tightened. He reached forward with a trembling hand, brushing his fingertips against the wax lines. The colors bled faintly under his touch, leaving a smear on his glove. Lila, his chest constricted painfully. His daughter had been here, not just hiding, surviving. She had drawn herself into this nightmare, leaving a map for anyone who cared enough to look. His flashlight shifted, revealing another set of drawings farther down the wall. These weren't cheerful. They were frantic, jagged. The stick girl was smaller, crouched in a corner, lines of blue drawn around her like bars. Beside her, the tall figure loomed. And on its arm, crudely sketched but unmistakable, was a scar. A long slash across the forearm. Logan's breath stuttered. He reached for the wall again, his hand hovering inches from the crayon. He He remembered Erin's voice, the way she had whispered about the fear she'd carried for years that monsters didn't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they smiled in daylight. Sometimes they lived among you. The dog growled softly, pulling him back to the present. Ben stood stiffly, his body angled toward the deeper tunnel ears, pinned eyes blazing. He barked once, the sound bouncing off the stone like a gunshot. Logan steadied the rifle in his hands. His heart thundered against his ribs, but his grip was steady, his jaw set. He forced his voice into the air, low and grim. "You're doing good, girl," he whispered into the silence, as if Lila could hear him through the walls. "Daddy's here. I'm not stopping until I find you." The tunnel stretched darker ahead, the weight of the mountain pressing down on every step. Logan felt the ground dampen under his boots, the air turning heavier, each breath colder. The drawings trailed along the wall for another 20 feet before stopping abruptly, as if the child's crayons had run out or been taken away. Ben's growls deepened. He crouched low, shoulders taut, muscles trembling with restrained fury. His eyes locked on the shadowed corridor ahead, his body straining forward, though his wounds screamed against the effort. Logan shifted his light. The beam slid over the damp floor. There, a small piece of cloth, pale blue, wedged into a crack of the stone wall. Torn, stained faintly red. Logan's chest tightened as his knees buckled beneath him. His gloved hand shook as he reached out and pulled it free. He recognized it instantly. It was from Lila's pajamas. His vision blurred for a moment, the storm outside and the darkness inside, crashing together in his mind. He clenched the fabric tight, holding it like it was her hand. He whispered her name, a promise woven into every syllable. Lila. Ben barked again, snapping him out of the spiral. The dog was at the end of the beam, now pawing at the ground, near an old wooden door, half rotted into the tunnel wall. He snarled, teeth flashing, body pressed low. Logan's pulse spiked. He crossed quickly, stepping over broken boards, every sense sharpened to a razor's edge. The door loomed before him. Its frame splintered, its iron hinges eaten by rust. The smell here was stronger, dampness, rot, and something more chemical, sharp enough to sting the back of his throat. Ben clawed harder, his paws striking the wood with a frantic rhythm. He let out a sharp whine, the kind that sounded like both plea and command. Logan raised the flashlight, shining it across the door's surface. And there, scratched deep into the wood with something sharp, were letters. Not neat. Not even. But letters. 3 of them. Lil. Logan's vision blurred again as his knees hit the ground. His fingers traced the grooves, the edges splintering under his touch. She had been here. She had carved this herself, fighting through the dark. Ben whined again, pressing his muzzle to the crack at the bottom of the door, sniffing hard, then growling deep in his chest. Logan pressed his forehead against the wood, his breath shaking. His wife's words rang again in his ears. "Don't ever stop fighting if a child needs you. Don't ever give up, not for anything." He closed his eyes, whispered one word, like a vow. "Hold on." Then he rose, slammed the butt of his rifle against the door. Once. Twice. On the third strike, the wood splintered shards, snapping away, the sound echoing down the tunnel like a gunshot. Ben barked furiously, his body ready to surge through the opening. And with a final ragged breath, Logan kicked the door wide. The darkness inside opened like a wound. And somewhere faint but undeniable came the sound of a child's sob. The door crashed open, splinters scattering across the stone floor. Logan stepped inside the beam of his flashlight, cutting into the dark. The smell hit him first, metallic sour, the stench of rust and fear. His heart thundered, every nerve in his body screaming as the sound reached him. A sob. Small, fragile. "Lila." His voice cracked, his chest seizing. Ben surged past him, nose low, tail stiff, his body. A trembling arrow of instinct. The dog's claws scraped against the damp stone as he followed the sound. Then came another noise. Different. Low, metallic. Chains. Logan froze, breath caught in his throat. His beam slid across the floor, over puddles, over broken boards, then landed on it. A chain thick and rusted bolted into the wall. The links rattled softly as the shadows shifted. And then he heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. From the far end of the chamber, where the dark was thickest, a figure emerged. The light caught first on the shoes, polished leather out of place in the filth. Then on the tailored slacks, the expensive coat, finally, the face. Grant Mitchell, the mayor of Pine Creek. Logan's stomach dropped like stone. He had shaken this man's hand at fundraisers, stood beside him. At town vigils, nodded at his speeches about community and faith. Mitchell had been the polished veneer Pine Creek clung to in its hardest years. The man everyone trusted. But here in the damp bowels of a forgotten mine, there was nothing polished left about him. His smile was wrong. Stretched thin eyes glinting with a cold that stripped the air bare. Well, Mitchell drawled, his voice smooth as glass, echoing against the stone. "If it isn't Sheriff Reed, Pine Creek's golden soldier." Logan's grip tightened on the rifle. His throat was dry, his body taut as a bowstring. "Where is she?" Mitchell's smile widened, but his eyes stayed dead. "Right where you left her." Ben's growl cut through the silence, low and guttural, as the dog planted himself between Logan and the mare. His teeth bared his ears, pinned back ready. Mitchell's gaze slid to the dog, amusement flickering at the edges of his expression. "That's the mud everyone's been whispering about. I should have known. They say dogs can smell the truth. Shame he's too late." Logan stepped forward, the beam of his flashlight slicing across Mitchell's face. "You took her." His voice was raw steel. "You took my little girl." Mitchell tilted his head, almost curious. "You say that like you didn't know. Like you haven't seen how broken your town has become. People turn a blind eye when the monster wears a tie." "Shut your mouth!" The mayor chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You can't even admit it to yourself, can you? You failed her. You failed your wife. And now here you are, chasing ghosts through the snow like some desperate fool." The words were knives, cutting deeper than the cold ever could. Logan's vision blurred for a moment. Erin's face, pale and fragile in her hospital bed, whispering her final plea. "Don't give up if a child needs you." He steadied his breath. "Where is Lila?" Mitchell's smile sharpened. "Oh, she's close. She's always been close. But you won't leave here with her. Not alive." And from his coat, Mitchell drew a gun. The metallic click as he cocked it echoed through the chamber like a death knell. Ben barked furiously, his body lunging forward, restrained only by Logan's quick command. "Stay!" Logan barked back, his voice iron. Mitchell raised the gun, his hands steady, his eyes flat with the calm of a man who had rehearsed this moment. "You know," he said, almost conversational, "you were never supposed to find this place. But that dog?" He flicked his gaze at Ben. "Persistent creatures. Almost admirable. Almost." "You touch her." Logan growled, every syllable a razor edge. "And I swear to God." Mitchell cut him off with a laugh, sharp and cruel. "Swear to God. Where was your God when your wife burned? Where was he when your daughter screamed for you in the dark?" Logan's blood boiled. His finger itched on the trigger of his rifle, but he couldn't fire, not with Mitchell standing between him and the shadows where Lila might be. Mitchell took a slow step closer, gun never wavering. "I should thank you, really. You made this easy. You drank yourself half to death, buried yourself in grief, left the town to me. And now here you are, thinking you can play hero again." Logan's chest heaved, fury and anguish twisting together until his vision pulsed red. He forced the words out low, lethal. "You're going to pay for every second she spent down here." Mitchell's smile flickered just briefly, revealing the rot beneath the charm. His voice dropped cold as the storm outside. "No, Sheriff. Tonight the only one paying is you." He raised the gun higher, the barrel leveling at Logan's chest. For a heartbeat, the chamber froze. Ben's body coiled like a spring muscles, straining despite his wounds. Logan's grip tightened, sweat slicking his palms despite the cold. His mind raced the storm outside, roaring in his ears, the memory of Erin's eyes burning behind his own. And from the shadows behind Mitchell, faint but unmistakable, came a whisper. "Daddy!" Logan's world shattered. "Lila," he breathed, his eyes snapping to the corner beyond the mare. Mitchell smirked, following his gaze, and for the first time Logan saw her. Huddled against the wall, wrists bound by a chain face streaked with dirt and tears, was his little girl. Her eyes were wide, terrified, but alive. Mitchell tilted his head, almost casual. "Pretty, isn't she strong too? Takes after her mother." Logan's vision burned. His every muscle screamed to charge, to tear Mitchell apart with his bare hands. But the gun stayed fixed on him, the distance between them heavy as a canyon. The mayor's voice dropped into a whisper, cruel and intimate. "You can't save her. You never could." And then he tightened his finger on the trigger. The trigger was tightening when the world exploded. Ben launched himself forward like a streak of muscle and fury, his jaws clamping down on Mitchell's arm with bone-crushing force. The gun fired, the blast deafening in the tight stone chamber, the flash searing the dark. The bullet went wide, slamming into the rock wall inches from Logan's head, showering them all in sparks and stone chips. Mitchell screamed, a raw, guttural sound torn from his throat as Ben's teeth sank deeper into flesh. Blood sprayed against the dog's muzzle, but Ben didn't let go. His growls were primal, the sound of a creature who had nothing left to give but everything. Ben Logan roared, surging forward. Mitchell staggered, swinging the gun wildly with his free hand. He smashed the butt of it into Ben's side once, twice desperate to break the grip. Ben yelped, but held on, his body shaking violently as he tore and wrenched. Logan slammed into Mitchell with the full force of a Marine who had survived wars. The two men crashed against the stone wall, the impact reverberating through the mine. Mitchell grunted, his breath foul and hot in Logan's face as the gun clattered against the floor. They fought like men with nothing to lose. Fists connected with flesh bones cracked under pressure. Logan's knuckles split open as he drove his fist into Mitchell's jaw, the sound a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber. Mitchell retaliated with a headbutt, stars bursting behind Logan's eyes as pain flared across his skull. He stumbled back, disoriented, blood dripping into his vision. Ben lunged again, but Mitchell kicked him viciously in the ribs, sending the dog sliding across the wet floor. Ben whimpered, his body trembling, but even as he struggled, he tried to push himself back up. No. Lila's scream pierced the chaos, high and desperate. She yanked at the chains, holding her tears streaking her dirty cheeks. "Daddies?" The sound snapped Logan's vision back into razor focus. He wiped the blood from his eyes, planted his boots, and charged. Mitchell met him head-on. The two collided, grappling in the claustrophobic space, their breath coming in violent bursts. The mayor's face was a mask of fury now, the polished veneer stripped away, revealing the predator beneath. "You should have stayed broken," Mitchell spat, driving his knee into Logan's ribs. Pain shot through Logan's chest, forcing the air from his lungs. Logan gritted his teeth, slammed his forehead into Mitchell's nose. The sickening crunch filled the air, followed by Mitchell's howl of rage. Blood poured down his face, his grip momentarily weakening. Logan seized the chance. He shoved Mitchell back against the wall, his forearm pressing against the man's throat. "You'll never touch her again." Mitchell's eyes glinted with malice, even as his face purpled from the pressure. His lips curled into a grotesque smile. "You think you've won? You don't even know how deep this goes." Logan's rage surged hotter, but before he could finish it, Mitchell's hand shot to his belt. A blade flashed in the dim light. Logan barely jerked aside as the knife slashed upward, the blade grazing his side, tearing through fabric and skin. He gasped, pain flaring white hot, his grip faltering. Mitchell shoved hard, breaking free. He drove Logan backward, slamming him into the ground. The knife gleamed as he raised it high, aiming for Logan's chest. Ben barreled into him again, despite the blood dripping from his muzzle, his wounded body screaming in defiance. His jaws locked around Mitchell's wrist, twisting the blade away, inches before it plunged into Logan's heart. Mitchell bellowed, his arm contorting under the dog's relentless grip. Logan kicked upward, his boot connecting with Mitchell's knee. The man buckled, collapsing half to the side, his knife clattering onto the stone floor. Adrenaline roaring through him, Logan scrambled, driving his elbow into Mitchell's temple. The mayor's body slammed into the wall again, head bouncing off the jagged stone. Ben released his grip, staggering back his chest, heaving, his eyes never leaving Mitchell. Logan panted, chest-burning, ribs aching. He forced himself upright, grabbed the length of chain binding Lila, and yanked with all his strength. The rusted bolts groaned, then gave way with a screech that echoed through the chamber. Lila tumbled into his arms, her tiny body shaking violently. He pulled her close, kissing the top of her matted hair. "I've got you, baby girl. I've got you." She clung to him, sobbing into his chest. "I knew you'd come." He pressed his cheek against her head, his voice breaking. "I'll never leave you again. I promise." Ben limped over, pressing his head against Lila's side, a soft whine rumbling from deep within his chest. For one breath, the world seemed to still. For one breath, Logan thought it was over. Then Mitchell moved, a shadow against the far wall, a sudden lunge. His hand closing around the knife again. Logan barely had time to react, before Ben threw himself forward, his body colliding with Mitchell's. The knife scraped harmlessly against the stone floor as the two crashed into a heap. Logan scrambled to grab the gun Mitchell had dropped earlier. His hand closed around the cold steel, the weight of it grounding him. He turned back just as Mitchell shoved Ben off him and staggered to his feet. Their eyes met across the chamber. Mitchell's face was a mask of blood and rage. His breath ragged, but his grin twisted back into place. "This isn't the end, Sheriff." He spun, shoving a loose board aside, revealing a narrow tunnel carved into the stone. Logan lunged, but it was too late. Mitchell slipped into the passage, his footsteps echoing away into the darkness. "Damn it!" Logan cursed, his voice shaking with fury. He surged forward, but the tunnel was too narrow, too unstable, every creak threatening collapse. Charging after Mitchell would risk Lila. Ben staggered beside him, his body trembling, but his eyes locked on Logan's. The message was clear. Protect her. Logan dropped to his knees, clutching Lila tighter. His chest heaved as he whispered into her hair. "You're safe. That's all that matters now. You're safe." Lila's tears soaked through his shirt as she whispered back, "Don't let him come back." Logan's jaw clenched, his heart splitting between the promise he'd made and the fury burning inside him. He held her tighter, his breath trembling. He won't, he vowed. I swear he won't. Behind them, the storm's howls filtered faintly through the tunnel's cracks. The mine groaned under the weight of decades. And though Mitchell had vanished into the shadows, Logan knew the fight wasn't finished. Not yet. But for now, for this breath, for this moment, his daughter was in his arms. And that was enough to keep him standing. The fluorescent lights of the makeshift hospital flickered against the storm-darkened windows. Outside, Pine Creek was buried under a suffocating blanket of snow. But inside, the air was heavy with the sharp tang of antiseptic, the low hum of medical equipment, and the ragged breaths of those who had survived more than they ever should have. Logan sat on the edge of a cot, his face carved in shadows, his hands trembling despite the blanket draped over his shoulders. His boots were still wet, crusted with slush and blood. He hadn't spoken a word since they'd carried Lila in, wrapped in a thermal blanket so small it barely covered her trembling frame. Now she lay propped against a stack of thin pillows, an IV taped to her small hand. Her face, pale beneath streaks of grime, seemed impossibly fragile. Her lashes fluttered a tiny bird struggling to take flight. "Daddy?" The word was a whisper so faint Logan thought for a moment he'd imagined it. His chest broke open. He leaned forward instantly, taking her hand in both of his, pressing it to his lips as tears surged hot and unrelenting down his cheeks. "I'm here, baby girl. I'm right here." Her lips quivered, trying to shape a smile. "The dog." Her voice cracked with exhaustion. "He never left me." Logan's throat tightened until it was hard to breathe. He brushed damp strands of hair from her forehead, his voice unsteady. "Ben. His name's Ben." Her eyes flicked to the corner of the tent where Ben lay stretched on a thick blanket. His body was still too still, his chest rising in shallow, uneven waves. The makeshift veterinary team worked quietly around him, IV fluids hanging beside him, the light catching the dark stains on the bandages that wrapped his ribs. "They tried to make me scared," Lila whispered, her tiny hand gripping Logan's tighter. "But I wasn't. Not when he was there." Logan swallowed the knot in his throat. "He kept you safe." Her eyes met his, glistening, searching. "He told me you were coming." The word struck him like a blow, stealing the air from his lungs. For a moment he couldn't speak. He could only stare at her, heart pounding with a strange, inexplicable mix of awe and grief. He told you that?" She nodded faintly. "Not with words. I just knew. Here." Her small fingers pressed lightly against her chest. "In my belly." Logan closed his eyes, his tears spilling freely now. He pressed her hand to his heart, whispering, "I would have walked through hell to find you." A quiet whimper drew his gaze back to the corner. Ben's body shuddered faintly, his paw twitching against the blanket. Logan's chest clenched. He rose slowly, brushing Lila's cheek with trembling fingers. "I'll be right here, baby. Don't close your eyes yet. I'll be right back." She nodded weakly, her gaze drifting back to the dog. "Tell him, thank you." Logan crossed the room, every step weighted with dread. The vet, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and blood-stained gloves, looked up as he approached. She shook her head slowly. "He's fighting, but the wounds are deep. Too much blood loss. If he makes it through the night, it will be a miracle." Logan crouched beside Ben, his breath trembling as he placed a hand gently on the dog's head. The fur was damp, sticky warm beneath his palm. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It's me." Ben's eyes flickered open, amber shining faintly through the haze of pain. His gaze found Logan's, instantly steady, unblinking. "You brought her back to me," Logan said, his throat thick with emotion. "You did what I couldn't. You never gave up. Not once." Ben's tail moved just enough to brush against the blanket. Barely a twitch, but it was enough. Logan leaned closer, pressing his forehead against the dog's, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You're not just a dog. You're family. My family." Ben exhaled softly, a shaky breath that rattled deep in his chest. His eyes slid closed again, but his body leaned faintly against Logan's touch, as if surrendering to the weight of the words. For the first time in years, Logan felt the crack in his heart close, if only by a thread. He thought of Erin, of her last words, of the promise he had carried like a broken shard of glass. "Don't give up if a child needs you." He hadn't given up. Neither had Ben. A nurse approached quietly, whispering that Lila needed rest. Logan nodded without looking away from Ben. "Stay with him," he murmured. "Don't let him be alone." When he returned to Lila's bedside, she was still awake, her eyes heavy, but locked on him. "Is he okay?" Logan brushed his thumb across her small hand. "He's strong. He's the bravest dog I've ever known." She smiled faintly, "Just like you." The words unraveled him. He gathered her carefully into his arms, holding her against his chest, breathing in the faint scent of her hair beneath the sterile hospital air. His tears fell silently onto her blanket as he whispered, "You're safe now. I won't let anyone hurt you again." Outside, the storm howled on, rattling the thin walls of the tent. But inside, a fragile warmth bloomed between father and daughter, bound by the sacrifice of a dog who refused to surrender. And though the night was long, Logan knew one thing with a clarity that cut through the darkness. Like a blade, he was not alone anymore, not while Ben still breathed. The storm outside had eased into a steady ghost-like whisper, the kind that made the thin walls of the field hospital shiver. Inside, the world felt smaller, tighter, as if the weight of the truth pressing in on them had shrunk the air itself. Logan sat at Lila's bedside, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped so tightly the veins on his knuckles rose pale against his skin. Across the room, the glow of a laptop illuminated the worried face of Deputy Clara Hayes, her fingers poised nervously above the keyboard. On the table beside her sat the small, weather-worn camera barely larger than a matchbox that had been strapped to Ben's collar when they'd found him. But first, Logan wanted to hear from Lila, directly. Her small voice cracked the silence, fragile, but certain. He had a scar. Logan's head snapped up, his chest tightening. "What kind of scar, baby?" Lila's eyes darted toward the ceiling, her lashes heavy as if she were pulling the memory up from somewhere she wished she could bury it. On his hand, right here. She lifted her tiny fingers and traced the inside of her left wrist, long and white, like a rope burn. Logan leaned closer, every nerve in his body on edge. He remembered shaking hands with Grant Mitchell, hundreds of times the town's beloved mayor, the man who'd stood behind podiums, preaching unity and safety. And he remembered that scar faint beneath the cuff of a crisp shirt, almost unnoticeable, unless you knew where to look. Logan's throat tightened. Did he talk to you, Lila? Her lips quivered. Not much. He just smelled like the stuff in the nurse's office. You know, the stingy kind Mommy used when I scraped my knee. Strong, like medicine. It made me feel sick. Antiseptic? Clara whispered, typing quickly. Lila nodded faintly, curling deeper into her blanket. When he came close, it hurt my nose. But the dog, Ben, he always stayed between us. Even when I couldn't see, I knew he was there. Logan brushed her hair back with trembling fingers. You were so brave. Braver than anyone I've ever known. Tears slipped down the little girl's cheeks, but her gaze didn't waver. He said Daddy couldn't find me. But Ben told me that wasn't true. The words shattered something deep inside Logan, breaking him open and stitching him back together in the same breath. He pulled her gently into his arms, pressing his cheek to her hair. He was right. I'd never stop looking for you. Clara cleared her throat softly. Sheriff, we should look at the footage. Logan kissed Lila's forehead, settling her back against the pillows. I'll be right here. Close your eyes if you need to, sweetheart. She nodded, gripping his hand as if she were afraid he'd vanish the moment she blinked. Logan turned toward the table, his chest heaving as Clara pressed play. The screen flickered. Static crackled, then stabilized into shaky, grainy footage. The perspective was low, jerky Ben's view as he moved through the dark corridors of the mine. The beam of Logan's flashlight earlier had left streaks across the damp stone walls, but this angle showed more. A narrow hallway, shadows moving, and then Logan's stomach dropped. There he was. Grant Mitchell, clear as day, even in the poor light. His tailored coat dusted with dirt, his gloved hands moving with calm, deliberate purpose. The camera caught the faint gleam of a silver watch as he reached for a set of keys dangling from his belt. Logan's chest constricted, his pulse pounding in his ears. He leaned closer, his breath harsh. Son of a... Clara froze the frame. The image sharpened, focusing on Mitchell's face as he glanced briefly toward the camera. His eyes, cold and calculating, seemed to pierce through the screen. That's him, Logan whispered, his voice raw with fury. The bastard everyone in this town swears by. The man they trust. Clara's voice was tight. This could be enough. But Sheriff, you know what he controls. The council, the police board, half the judges in the county. Logan's hands clenched into fists, his nails biting into his palms. I don't care if he owns the whole damn state. He took my little girl. He put his hands on her. And I'll see him burn for it. Clara glanced toward Lila, her voice softening. We'll need her testimony too. The scar, the smell, everything. Logan hesitated, his gaze falling back to his daughter. She had finally closed her eyes, her hand still gripping his tightly. Her face pale but calm now, looked too young to carry the weight of monsters. She's just a kid, he murmured. She shouldn't have to sit in front of a courtroom full of strangers and relive hell. Clara's voice dropped steady but firm. Without her, Sheriff, he'll walk. You know he will. Logan's heart twisted violently. He wanted to shield Lila from every shadow, every scar, every nightmare Mitchell had left behind. But he also knew if Mitchell walked free, other children would suffer. Other fathers would sit in this same chair praying for miracles that might never come. The laptop chimed, pulling their attention back. The footage resumed, showing Ben's relentless journey deeper into the mine. His paws padded through the dirt claws, scraping against stone. The camera jolted as he shoved through a broken vent cover. Then Lila, small, frail, curled on a threadbare mattress. The frame shook as Ben nudged closer, his muzzle pressing against her side, his tail brushing faintly against the floor. Her tiny hand lifted, touching his head, as if clinging to the last piece of hope she had left. Logan's breath hitched. Tears blurred his vision. He reached instinctively toward the screen, his fingers brushing against the image, as if he could touch her through it. "My God," he whispered. He stayed with her, every second. Clara swallowed hard, her own eyes glistening. This is more than evidence. This is proof of what he is. A guardian. The footage cut abruptly to chaos, the struggle with Mitchell. Blurred movements, snarls, grunts, the flash of steel. Ben's growls echoed through the tiny speakers, fierce and unrelenting, even as the frame shuddered violently. Then static. Clara closed the laptop gently. The silence in the room, suddenly deafening. Logan sat back, his chest heaving, his jaw clenched. That's enough to bury him. But he'll fight, Clara said. With lawyers, with money, with the weight of his name. The town worships him, Logan. They won't want to believe it. Logan looked back at Lila, asleep now. Her small fingers still curled around his. His voice was low, steady, dangerous. Then we'll make them believe, even if it kills me. A soft sound came from the corner. Logan turned quickly. Ben stirred faintly, his paw twitching, his chest rising in a ragged breath. The vet leaned closer, adjusting the IV. He's holding on, she whispered. Logan crossed the room, crouched low again beside Ben. His hand trembled as he brushed gently over the dog's muzzle. You're the reason we're still here, he murmured. I swear to you I won't stop until he's behind bars. You did your part. Now it's my turn. Ben's eyes flickered open for a second, glinting faintly in the dim light. Logan felt the faintest brush of a tail against his boot. It was enough to ignite a fire in him, stronger than any fear. He rose, his shoulders squared, his gaze hard as steel. He looked at Clara. Get me every file we have on Mitchell. Every donation, every council vote, every backroom deal. We're going to rip his mask off piece by piece. And the town, Clara asked softly. Logan's jaw set. They'll see the truth, even if I have to bleed it into the snow myself. Outside, the storm raged on, battering against the canvas walls, but inside something unyielding had awakened. Logan Reed was no longer a father lost in grief. He was a soldier again, this time fighting not for country, but for his daughter, for justice, for the dog lying broken, yet unbowed on the floor. And for the first time since Aaron's death, Logan knew he wasn't alone in the fight. The night had teeth. Snow ripped across Pine Creek like claws, shredding what little calm the town had left after Logan Reed presented the footage to the FBI. The revelation of Grant Mitchell, their polished, beloved mayor, had detonated through the community like a landmine. Families whispered behind locked doors, churches filled with murmurs and suspicion. Some said it couldn't be true. Others swore they'd known all along. And in between were the hollow-eyed parents who now wondered if their missing children hadn't run away at all. Inside the sheriff's office, Logan stood with his back to the frosted window, arms folded, jaw clenched so tight he thought his teeth might crack. The fluorescent light overhead flickered, casting pale shadows that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his racing heartbeat. Deputy Clara Hayes dropped another file onto the table, her voice flat with exhaustion. The FBI's confirmed chain of custody on the footage. They'll move forward, but it won't be quick. Mitchell's already mobilizing lawyers. Half the county council has gone silent. Logan rubbed a hand over his stubbled jaw, the weight of his badge digging into his chest like it was carved from stone. People don't want to believe it. They'll have to, Clara said, but her voice carried doubt. In the corner, Lila sat curled on a blanket, Ben lying beside her. The Malinois' breathing was shallow, each rise of his chest a fragile promise he might not be able to keep. Bandages wrapped his flank and foreleg, fresh blood seeping faintly through despite the vet's best efforts. Yet his eyes stayed open, fixed on the door, as though daring the world to try and touch her again. Lila's small hand rested on his side, feeling the tremors of pain that rippled beneath his fur. She whispered, "It's okay, Ben. Daddy won't let them hurt us again." Logan's throat burned at the words. He wanted to believe them. But he knew Mitchell wasn't finished, not yet. The phone rang, not the landline. Logan's cell, a number he didn't recognize. He answered cautiously, Reed. The voice on the other end was low, smooth mocking. You made a mistake, Sheriff. Logan froze, his knuckles whitening around the phone. Mitchell, I should thank you. The mayor continued, his tone almost cheerful. Now I know exactly who I'm dealing with. You could have looked the other way, but you didn't. So now you'll watch your world collapse piece by piece. Logan's voice dropped a lethal whisper. If you come near my daughter again, I'll bury you myself. Mitchell chuckled softly. Oh, I won't have to. Others will take care of it for me. You see, loyalty runs deep in this town. Deeper than your badge. Deeper than your dog's bite. The line went dead. Clara's eyes met Logan's as he lowered the phone, his face pale and hard. What did he say? Logan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The sudden crack of gunfire outside spoke for him. The window shattered. Glass rained down as Lila screamed. Logan lunged, pulling her behind the desk, his body shielding hers. Clara, lights out. Clara slammed the switch. Darkness swallowed the room, broken only by the red pulse of the emergency radio. Ben was already on his feet despite his injuries, a low growl vibrating in his throat. Another shot split the night, carving into the wooden frame of the doorway. They're here, Logan hissed. The office erupted in chaos. Clara scrambled for the shotgun mounted on the wall rack. Logan drew his sidearm, the cold metal an extension of his will. He whispered sharply to Lila, stay down. Don't move, no matter what you hear. Her eyes wide with terror locked on his. She nodded, clutching Ben's fur with both hands. The dog didn't flinch. The door exploded inward, splintering off its hinges. Two masked men stormed in, rifles raised the storm's howl at their backs. Logan fired first. The crack echoed like thunder, dropping one man before he'd cleared the threshold. The second ducked returning fire bullets, chewing into the plaster inches from Logan's head. Ben lunged. His body slammed into the attacker's arm teeth, sinking deep into flesh. The man screamed, his weapon clattering to the floor as Ben's jaws held firm despite his bleeding side. Ben, Logan shouted, surging forward. He kicked the rifle away, slamming his shoulder into the man's chest. They crashed against the wall, fists flying in the dark. The intruder fought like a man, desperate, eyes wild above the mask. He slammed a fist into Logan's ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. Logan retaliated, his elbow cracking against the man's jaw. The fight blurred into grunts and flashes of pain until the man's head struck the corner of the desk with a sickening thud. Silence. Logan staggered back, chest heaving, his pistol still trained on the fallen body. The only sound was Lila's shaky sobs and Ben's ragged breathing. Daddy! Logan turned quickly, kneeling beside her. His hands trembled as he cupped her face. I'm here, baby girl. I'm not going anywhere. But when he looked at Ben, his stomach twisted. The dog lay on his side now, panting heavily, blood soaking through the bandage at his ribs. God, no. Logan muttered, pressing his hand gently to the wound. Stay with me, boy. Don't you dare leave her. Ben's eyes fluttered, but he didn't close them. His gaze drifted to Lila, steady and unyielding, as if reminding her he wasn't done yet. His tail thumped once, weak but determined. Clara rushed over, shotgun still in hand, scanning the shattered doorway. More will come. That wasn't all of them. Logan's jaw tightened. Then we hold this line. He moved quickly, dragging the desk into position as a barricade. Clara covered the windows, her voice shaking. The FBI's on their way. They'll be here. Too late, Logan cut in. His eyes burned with a ferocity Clara hadn't seen since the Corps. It's just us now. Outside, headlights cut through the storm, crawling toward the station. Shadows of more figures moved against the snow. Logan crouched low beside Ben, his voice steady despite the quake in his chest. You've done enough. Rest now. I'll take it from here. But Ben didn't rest. He shifted, forcing himself upright, despite the pain pressing close against Lila's side, as if to make sure the storm couldn't steal her away again. Logan swallowed hard. All right, then. We fight together. The headlights stopped. Doors slammed. Boots crunched on ice. The storm carried their voices, rough, eager. Logan raised his pistol, the storm howling in chorus with the pounding of his heart. Behind him, Lila whispered into Ben's fur, her voice small but fierce. You promised you'd never leave me. Ben's ears flicked at the sound. And in that moment, Logan realized something terrifyingly beautiful. The dog wasn't staying alive for himself. He was staying alive for her. The first shot rang out. The battle for Pine Creek had begun. The storm hadn't slowed. It had grown teeth. Snow lashed across Pine Creek like shrapnel, the kind that clawed skin raw and swallowed breath before it could leave the lungs. Logan Reed's patrol truck jolted over frozen ruts as he steered down the half-buried logging road that wound toward the lake. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel. Beside him, Ben sat upright, despite the tremors coursing through his body, blood seeping again through his patched side. His ears twitched, nose working the frozen air like a compass set not by metal, but by memory and duty. Logan's jaw was clenched, his mind running like a war drum. The call from Clara had confirmed it. Mitchell had been seen heading toward the abandoned storage warehouse near Pine Creek Lake. It was where he'd once hosted his glossy charity auctions. Now, under cover of storm, it was a cage. And Logan knew this was it, the final card. He glanced at Ben, whose amber eyes glimmered through exhaustion. "You sure you're up for this, partner?" His voice cracked more than he'd like. Ben didn't answer, of course, but his body leaned forward, ears fixed toward the unseen horizon, as if daring Logan to doubt him. The truck skidded as Logan braked hard. Ahead through the curtain of white, the dark outline of the warehouse rose against the frozen lake, its rusted siding creaking under the wind's assault. Faint lights glimmered inside, unnatural in a night like this. Logan killed the engine. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the roar of the storm and the hammering of his pulse. He loaded his pistol, slid a spare magazine into his belt, then reached out to Ben. The Malinois pressed his head briefly against Logan's hand, then pushed forward toward the door as if saying, "Enough waiting." They moved low across the ice-crusted lot. Logan's boots crunched softly. Ben padded at his side, silent, a shadow cut from the storm itself. The warehouse door groaned open when Logan pulled the hinges, crying out like a warning. Inside, the air was colder than death itself, sharp with the smell of iron mold and the acrid sting of burned kerosene. The cavernous interior was lit by swinging bulbs, their glow carving jagged shadows across crates stacked like barricades. Logan's instincts screamed, this was a kill zone. "Welcome, Sheriff," the voice echoed from the far end. Logan froze, his pistol raised. From behind a stack of crates, Grant Mitchell stepped into the light. He looked untouchable, dressed in his tailored coat hair, immaculate despite the storm. His lips curled into a smile that never touched his eyes. And in those eyes, cold steel burned. "You just don't know when to quit," Mitchell said, his voice almost gentle, like a teacher disappointed in his pupil. "You could have walked away, saved your girl, saved yourself." Logan's chest rose and fell steady despite the inferno raging inside him. "You laid hands on my daughter? You think I'd ever walk away from that?" Mitchell chuckled, but it was hollow. "You're outnumbered." The sound of boots scraping metal answered the threat. From the shadows, masked men emerged, rifles raised. Their faces were blank movements, precise. At least 4, maybe more. Ben growled low and guttural, his body stiff despite the tremors. Logan's eyes darted. The odds weren't good. But odds had never saved a Marine. Will had. And right now, Will was all he had left. "Drop the gun," Sheriff Mitchell ordered, stepping closer. The scar on his left wrist caught the swinging light confirmation of Lila's terrified drawings. "Let's make this quick." Logan's grip tightened. He could feel sweat despite the cold feel every second dragging him closer to the edge. He glanced at Ben, whose gaze locked on him, unwavering. Mitchell's smile widened. "Or don't. Makes no difference. Either way, your little girl will learn what happens to people who cross me." The word snapped something inside Logan. A deafening crack split the silence. Logan fired first, the bullet sparking against metal as the masked men surged forward. Chaos ignited. Muzzle flashes lit the cavern like lightning. "Ben, go!" Logan shouted, diving behind a crate as bullets tore splinters into the air. The Malinois moved like a storm inside the storm. Despite the blood dripping from his side, he launched himself at the nearest gunman. His teeth sank deep into the man's arm, ripping the rifle from his grasp. The scream was swallowed by the storm's roar. Logan popped from cover 2 quick shots, dropping another man before he could steady his aim. The others returned fire bullets ricocheting off crates, sparks flying like fireworks. Mitchell stayed back calm amidst the carnage, his eyes locked on Logan. He raised his pistol, the barrel gleaming in the swinging light. Logan spun just as the shot rang out, but it never hit. Ben hurled himself between them, jaws clamping onto the masked man who had crept from the side, whose rifle had been trained on Logan's exposed back. The gun fired wild, the round chewing concrete, inches from Logan's head. Ben Logan's voice broke, torn between fury and terror. The dog didn't let go. Blood splattered the floor as he wrestled the man down, his growl vibrating through the cavern. Logan surged forward, his body fueled by a fire he hadn't felt in years. He closed the distance with Mitchell in seconds. The two collided, crashing into the metal railing of the loading dock. Mitchell fought hard, years of privilege replaced now, with the desperation of a cornered animal. He slammed a fist into Logan's ribs, tried to wrench the gun free. But Logan was a Marine, and every ounce of rage he'd bottled since Nora's death now exploded. "You took my wife!" Logan snarled, his elbows smashing into Mitchell's face. Blood sprayed from the mayor's nose. "You tried to take my daughter!" Mitchell clawed at Logan's face, spitting through blood. "You think this ends with me? You think I'm the only one?" Logan pinned him hard against the railing, the pistol digging into Mitchell's chest. "You're the one I've got. And that's enough." A final shot cracked. Silence followed. Mitchell sagged, the weapon falling from his hand. Logan's breath heaved, the metallic tang of blood heavy in the air. He cuffed the mayor with trembling hands, slamming the steel around his wrists, with a finality that echoed louder than the gunfire. From behind him, Ben collapsed, his body trembling violently. Logan's heart seized. He dropped to his knees beside the dog. "Stay with me, boy. Stay." Ben's eyes fluttered, but they found Logan's face. Found Lila in his memory. Found the promise he hadn't broken. His tail thumped once, faint as a heartbeat. Logan's vision blurred, tears cutting through grime and blood. "You did it. You saved us. You saved her." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer through the storm. The FBI. Reinforcements. Clara's voice crackled through the radio at Logan's hip. "We're almost there. Hold on." Logan glanced at Mitchell, bleeding and cuffed, then back to Ben. He gathered the dog gently into his arms, whispering, "You're not just a dog. You're family. And I'm not letting go." The storm howled outside. But inside the warehouse, for the first time, Logan felt something stronger than fear. Hope. The snow had quieted. Not the storm outside that still raged like a wounded beast clawing at the town of Pine Creek, but the snow inside the warehouse. Each flake that found its way through the broken roof beams seemed to fall slower, as if time itself knew it was standing witness to something it could not hurry. Logan Reed knelt on the cold concrete floor, his arms wrapped around the trembling body of Ben. The Malinois' chest heaved with shallow, jagged breaths, each one sounding more fragile than the last. Blood seeped through the bandage hastily tied around his ribs, soaking into Logan's sleeves, staining his hands red. The coppery scent mingled with the faint tang of gunpowder still hanging in the air. Beside him, little Lila was on her knees, her tiny arms wrapped tight around the dog's neck. Her cheeks were streaked with tears that refused to stop, her voice cracking in desperation. "Don't go," she whispered again and again, her words trembling against his fur. "Please, please, I need you." Logan's throat burned as he tried to find his voice. He had stared down death 100 times in combat, but nothing had prepared him for this, for the sight of his daughter clinging to a dying savior, for the helplessness gnawing through his chest like fire. He reached over and covered Lila's hand with his own, squeezing gently, though his own was trembling. Ben's amber eyes opened slowly, the light in them dimming, but still steady, still searching. He turned his head ever so slightly toward Lila, the effort almost too much. The girl pressed her forehead against his, her sobs breaking the silence like the storm breaking glass. "You can't leave me," she cried, her voice small yet fierce in its heartbreak. "You promised you'd watch me." Logan bit down on the sob rising in his chest. He wanted to promise her that Ben would stay, that everything would be fine, that miracles never ended. But he couldn't lie. Not to her. Not now. The dog exhaled a low, ragged breath. His paw twitched weakly against the floor, searching for something. Logan guided Lila's hand toward it. As her small fingers wrapped around his paw, Ben gave the faintest squeeze back, as if saying, "I'm still here. Don't be afraid." Logan leaned closer, his voice raw. "You did more than anyone could have asked. You brought her back to me. You gave me my daughter." His vision blurred. "You're not just a dog, Ben. You're family. Always." Lila's sobs grew softer, her breaths hitching as she whispered, "Don't leave, please." She buried her face in Ben's fur. And then, with the gentlest motion, Ben nudged his head against her hand. A simple touch, tender and deliberate, as though he wanted his final memory to be her warmth. His eyes lingered on her for one more heartbeat, then on Logan. A silent farewell. Snowflakes drifted through a crack above, settling gently on his fur, already dark with blood. One flake landed on his muzzle, pure white against the red, and then his chest stilled. The silence was deafening. Lila froze, her body rigid, as though she hadn't yet realized what had happened. Then the truth hit her like the storm outside, and she let out a cry that shattered Logan's heart into 1,000 pieces. "No," she screamed, clinging tighter. Come back, please come back. Logan pulled her close, wrapping his arms around both her and the still body of the dog. His own tears finally broke free, falling onto Ben's fur. He pressed his forehead against the Malinois' side. Thank you, he whispered through broken sobs. Thank you for everything. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the rusted walls, carrying with it the weight of all they had endured. Yet inside, the world slowed, and for a moment it felt like the storm bowed its head in silence. Logan lifted his face, his gaze meeting the faint light flickering above. He remembered Nora's last words spoken years ago before the fire took her. Never stop fighting for her, no matter what. He looked down at Lila, her small body trembling in his arms. He's not gone, sweetheart, Logan whispered softly. His voice broke, but he forced the words through. He'll always be with you. Every time you're scared, every time you're lost. You'll feel him, because he never left. Lila hiccuped through her sobs, her tearful eyes searching her father's face. You promise? Logan kissed the top of her head. I promise. She leaned down, brushing her lips against Ben's fur one last time. I love you, she whispered. The camera would linger, slow motion, capturing the snowfall as it blanketed the dog's body like a shroud of peace, each flake glimmering against the dim light. The scarred hero, lifeless now, but immortal in the bond he had forged. Logan gathered Lila in his arms, holding her close as they rose. He turned back once more, his chest breaking all over again at the sight. Ben lay still, bathed in the pale glow of falling snow, a warrior finally at rest. Logan's whisper barely carried over the storm. Rest easy, partner. You've done enough. The screen would fade to white, the sound of Lila's quiet sobs, echoing softly as the storm raged, on a cruel reminder of the cost of heroes. Under the morning sun, Pine Creek looked nothing like the town it had been a year ago. The heavy scars of winter had given way to soft green hills and cobblestone streets warmed by the golden light. Children laughed as they chased one another across the freshly painted benches of the town square, their voices bright, unbroken. Shops that had once shuttered their windows in fear now opened wide, spilling the scent of fresh bread and coffee into the breeze. Pine Creek had survived. More than that, it had healed. At the center of the square, surrounded by neat rows of flowers and a newly laid stone path, stood a bronze statue. Its figure was unmistakable, a Belgian Malinois head held high, body poised with quiet strength, every detail captured in lifelike precision. Beneath its paws, carved into the polished base, were words that glistened under the sunlight. Ngui hung kom fai luk now kung lakan ngui. The townspeople gathered in hushed reverence. Families clutched one another's hands. Men removed their hats. Women dabbed at their eyes with tissues as the mayor, no longer Grant Mitchell, but a woman elected after the scandal broke, stepped forward to open the memorial service. Her voice carried through the square, solemn yet warm, speaking of sacrifice, resilience, and the silent guardians who shape destinies. But the moment everyone waited for came when a small figure walked to the podium. Lila Parker, now 7 years old with her hair tied back by a ribbon of crimson red, climbed the steps slowly, her little shoes tapping against the wood. She wore a simple white dress, the kind her mother once dreamed she'd wear at recitals, and in her hands was a folded piece of paper. The crowd leaned forward, the air so still you could hear the rustle of her dress. Logan Reed, standing near the front row, his broad shoulders straight but his eyes glistening, watched her every step. He had never been prouder, never more terrified, yet never more certain that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Lila unfolded the paper with careful hands. She paused, took a shaky breath, and then began, her voice small but steady. There are heroes in this world who don't wear capes, and they don't always speak. Some heroes just love. They love so much that they'll fight for you, protect you, and never let you be alone. My hero didn't talk, but he told me everything I needed to know, with his eyes, with his heart. A murmur swept through the crowd. Tears spilled freely down cheeks, parents clutching their children tighter. Lila's own eyes shimmered, but she didn't falter. She lifted her gaze to the statue, her lips trembling into the smallest smile. His name was Ben, she said softly, and he was my best friend. He found me when I was lost. He stayed when I was scared. He gave me hope when I didn't have any left. And when he couldn't stay anymore, he gave me the strength to go on. Her voice wavered then, but Logan's presence in the front row, his hand pressed firmly over his heart, anchored her. She took another breath and continued. Ben showed me that love is the bravest thing in the world. That even when you're hurt, even when you're scared, love can make you strong. So today we remember him. Not just as a dog, not just as a friend, but as a hero. My hero. And I promise I'll never forget. The final words lingered in the air like a hymn. Silence followed. A silence so full it seemed to hum. Then slowly one person began to clap. Another joined. And then the entire square erupted applause, rolling like thunder, not wild but reverent, carrying the weight of grief, gratitude, and faith. Logan stood unable to hold back the tears that blurred his vision. He reached for Lila as she stepped down from the podium, and when her small hand found his, it fit perfectly. She looked up at him, eyes still wet, but now filled with something else, something stronger than the sadness that had once defined her. Hope. You did perfect, Logan whispered, his voice breaking. Lila leaned into him, her little hand clutching his. Do you think he heard me? Logan looked toward the statue, the bronze Malinois gleaming in the sun, and for a fleeting second he swore he could see the light catch its eyes just right, as though the spirit of the dog himself was looking back at them. He smiled through his tears. I don't think he ever stopped listening, Logan said. The townspeople began laying flowers at the base of the statue, roses, lilies, wildflowers, plucked fresh from the fields. Children placed their stuffed animals there, small tokens of love. Someone brought an old red scarf tattered at the edges and draped it gently across the bronze shoulders of the dog. The crowd gasped softly. The memory of that scarf was etched into every soul in Pine Creek. As the ceremony continued, Logan lifted Lila into his arms, holding her high enough so she could place her own small bouquet. She leaned forward, laying it carefully on the stone, her lips moving in a whisper no one else could hear. Thank you, Ben. A breeze picked up, then carrying the sound of the applause across the square, fluttering the ribbon in her hair, making the flowers sway. The sun shone brighter, breaking fully through the last of the clouds, casting a warm glow over the crowd. It felt as though Pine Creek itself was breathing again. Later, as the townsfolk slowly dispersed, Logan and Lila lingered. They stood hand in hand, staring at the statue in silence. Neither needed to speak. The weight in their hearts was still there, but it was no longer crushing. It was a weight they carried together, a reminder of love and sacrifice that would never fade. Daddy, Lila finally asked, her voice soft. Yes, sweetheart. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the sunlight, innocent but wise beyond her years. Do you think Mommy saw too? Logan bent down, kissing her forehead. His voice trembled, but his answer was sure. I think she never stopped watching Lila. And I think she's proud of both of us. They walked away slowly, the statue behind them glowing in the sun. As they left the square, Logan felt something he hadn't in years. Not just relief, not just survival, but belief. The belief that even in the darkest winters, light would always return. And sometimes that light came on 4 legs, with a heart too brave for this world. The Parker house had not felt like a home for a long time. For months after the storm, after the trial, after the night when the world itself seemed to collapse and then stitch itself back together, it had been more a shelter than a sanctuary. But now, a year later, it breathed again. The porch was newly painted pale blue shutters, flanking windows that spilled golden light across the yard. The air carried the scent of pine and fresh bread, and laughter drifted faintly from somewhere inside. It wasn't the same house it had been before tragedy struck, but maybe that was the point. Maybe it didn't need to be the same. Maybe it just needed to be theirs. Inside, the walls told their story. Photos lined the hallway in neat, careful frames. Some were old, rescued from boxes that had been left untouched for too long. Logan in his Marine uniform, standing straight-backed but smiling faintly at the camera. His late wife Emma holding a newborn Lila, with eyes so full of love they seemed to glow. And in the center, taken not long ago, was a picture of Lila with her hair tied back, her arms wrapped around the neck of a Belgian Malinois, whose fur bore scars like medals. That picture had been placed right next to a portrait of Emma, and for Lila, it felt like a family whole again. Lila padded barefoot down the hallway, her small fingers brushing against the frames, as though she were drawing strength from the memories. She stopped in front of the newest photograph, one of her standing in the square beside the statue of Ben, her eyes shining, though still wet with tears. She stared at it for a long moment before whispering, "You're still here, aren't you?" Logan stood a few steps behind, watching her quietly. He didn't interrupt. He'd learned that sometimes silence gave her more strength than words. But when she turned to him, her eyes searching for something she couldn't quite name, he stepped forward and rested a steady hand on her shoulder. "You know," he said softly, "your mom used to say, love never leaves. It just changes shape. Maybe Ben changed shape too." Lila's lips curved faintly, the kind of smile that carried both sadness and comfort. She nodded, clutching a small wooden carving in her hand. It was the same one she had placed at the foot of Ben's statue a week earlier. A carving of a dog with wings, though she had begged Logan to let her bring it home for one night. She held it close now, whispering words only she and the memory of Ben would hear. Con Chubazo Quinn. Just she murmured the Vietnamese words she had been practicing, echoing the phrase she'd overheard from Emma's journal once. Then she added with the innocence of a child, but the weight of a survivor. And you brought him back to me. Logan blinked hard, his throat tightening. He pulled her gently into his arms, pressing his cheek against her hair. She smelled of the cinnamon rolls they'd baked earlier, sweet and warm. And for a moment he allowed himself to believe that the world was finally safe again. The late afternoon light spilled across the living room floor, and outside the wind stirred the tall pines behind the house. Through the window, the town square was visible in the distance. The statue stood tall, its bronze surface gleaming as the setting sun caught its contours. From here, it almost looked alive, the eyes cast downward in eternal vigilance. Logan guided Lila toward the porch. They stepped outside, the air cool but soft, carrying the promise of spring. The square was quiet now, the ceremony over, but the flowers at the base of the statue still glowed in the fading light. The scarf draped across its shoulders swayed gently in the breeze, as though unseen hands had touched it. Lila let go of Logan's hand and ran a few steps ahead, stopping at the edge of the porch. She lifted her face to the wind, her hair whipping gently around her cheeks, her eyes closed as though she could feel Ben in the air itself. "Do you think he's happy now?" she asked, turning back toward Logan. He nodded slowly, his voice steady. "I think he always was, because he had you." She grinned through the tears that had begun to pool again, then skipped back to his side. Together they descended the porch steps and walked down the path toward the square. Each step felt like a ritual, the quiet crunch of gravel beneath their shoes, marking the passage of time they had both fought so hard to earn. When they reached the statue, Lila crouched down and placed the wooden carving at its base once more. She touched the cold bronze paw, her small hand trembling but determined. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. The breeze picked up again, and the last rays of sunlight struck the statue just right, casting a golden glow across its shoulders. For a fleeting moment, Logan swore he saw the faintest shimmer, as though Ben himself had given a silent nod. He glanced at Lila, whose eyes widened, her lips parting in wonder. "Did you see that?" she gasped. Logan smiled, his own chest tight with emotion. "I did," he said softly. They stood there for a long while, the town quiet around them, the world finally at peace. Logan's hand rested protectively on Lila's shoulder, and together they gazed at the statue, letting the silence speak for them. The wind stirred again, rustling the trees around the square. The scarf shifted slightly, its crimson threads catching the last light of day. And in that glow, in that stillness, there was a promise not spoken, not written, but felt deep in the heart, that love never dies, that loyalty never fades, that even in the darkest storms, light will always return. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Logan took Lila's hand once more. "Let's go home," he said gently. She squeezed his hand and nodded, her eyes still lingering on the statue. "He already is home," she whispered. They walked back toward their house, the pines swaying above them, the town settling into the quiet rhythm of evening. Behind them the statue stood eternal, bathed in the soft glow of twilight. And though the world moved forward, though days would come and go, Pine Creek would never forget, and neither would they. For some heroes never leave. They simply watch, waiting forever faithful.